barbiturates in the post-World War II America, those markets have been largely white, middle class to affluent, or pain complaints, complaints of anxiety. And so in post-World War II America, what we saw was actually an overdose crisis for barbiturates and later benzodiazepines, also anti-anxiety drugs, that rivaled the overdose crisis that we see today, and is part of a repeated cycle in that legal narcotics market that in the U.S. is quite race and class stratified, because bear in mind we don't have a national health service, and so our pharmaceutical developers and marketers are very focused on segments of the population that have the resources to buy new and expensive patented medications. But on the other hand, we've always had this coexisting twin of illegal street markets of drugs. And those have been concentrated in black and brown neighborhoods. And these markets have evolved in the wake of legal narcotics markets when the harms of the narcotics that have been sold to largely white affluent consumers become apparent. And so even heroin, which was marketed in 1898 by Bayer Pharmaceuticals to largely white affluent Victorian housewives, cough syrup for children, pain reliever for lower back pain and menstrual cramps. And then as the harms become obvious, they're illegalized and confined to low-income, largely black and brown markets. So over the past century, we've seen these cycles in which actually narcotics begin in more affluent white markets, where the consequences of their use are so vastly different. And we, of course, have the highest incarceration rate in the entire world in the U.S. as well. For example, black men 6 times as likely as white men in the U.S. to be incarcerated, even though rates of drug use are equivalent, and drug laws being responsible for a lot of that inequality.
Now, the BBC iPlayer series, Dopesick, it charts the history of America's deadly opioid addiction, and OxyContin, a brand name for oxycodone, a highly addictive painkiller used to treat severe pain. Now, I've got a clip from it here. This is a bereaved mother who was part of the parent-led nationwide pushback against Purdue Pharma, appealing to company representatives.
My daughter Betsy was a quiet, hard-working girl. After she hurt her back on her job, she started taking OxyContin. And within a year, she was a liar, a thief, and a heroin addict. No matter what she did, she couldn't stop. When she died from an overdose, there was a part of me that was relieved that she was finally out of her pain. But that pain lives in me now, and in her father. OxyContin destroyed our family, like it has so many others. We hope you can find a way to make it safer.
OxyContin eventually claimed nearly 500,000 lives, many in Rust Belt towns in Appalachian states such as West Virginia. Now, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to federal criminal charges and was dissolved in 2021 in a bankruptcy settlement that required the company's owners, members of the Sackler family, to turn over billions of dollars to address the opioid epidemic, and a bankruptcy court gave the family immunity in all civil cases. Eleanor, tell me a little of the history of OxyContin and the way it was marketed to a specific group of Americans.
Yes, it is a very tragic story, and I would say it's a story of how racial assumptions about who is prone to addiction and our very racialized drug markets actually end up harming white Americans along with Americans of color. So in '96, the FDA, in the context of a declared national epidemic of pain, gave Purdue Pharmaceuticals authorization to market OxyContin as a minimally addictive pain reliever suitable for moderate pain, including lower back pain. What this did was it opened the floodgates to aggressively market to primary care doctors the use of these actually dangerous opioids in a context where historically these opioids have been restricted to post-surgical pain, cancer pain. So all of a sudden primary care doctors across the country, but primarily in white areas of the country, and also in rural areas where blue-collar workers had workers' compensation insurance, and elders had forms of Medicare coverage that would pay for this newly patented opioid, expensive opioid. They were being sold the story that this was a safe drug for moderate complaints. So this happened alongside of advertisements showing primarily suburban white women and also white grandparents who were considered quote unquote trustworthy. This was in the context of a lot of congressional debates in Washington, D.C. about the status of disability benefits. So there were increasing claims of chronic and debilitating pain. And in order to bridge the gap between Republicans who really pushed back against any expansion of public benefits on the one side, and then on the other side, Democrats who, in light of upcoming elections, wanting to show that they were responding in a humane and empathetic way to the pain that Americans were reporting. A medical treatment for pain, an expensive patented medical treatment that was coming from the private sector, was the compromise. This was a way to show that politicians were responding while at the same time not expanding public benefits. And this was a huge window of opportunity to aggressively market OxyContin.
You had an experience, I think, of working in a methadone and in a brand new buprenorphine clinic. Tell me about the contrast.
I'll very quickly explain what methadone and buprenorphine are. I think both of them are in wide use in the UK. Methadone being a form of treatment for opioid use disorder that was introduced as President Nixon's first weapon in his war on drugs in 1971. It's just in the context of race riots in inner city US and a perceived epidemic of heroin that was somehow connected to this. So it's long been stereotyped in the US as a treatment for black and brown people in low-income neighborhoods, cities, and it has been confined to highly regulated clinics that require patients to come every day and be observed by a nurse, as opposed to buprenorphine, which was a huge regulatory breakthrough in 2002. The FDA approved buprenorphine, which, like methadone, it's used long-term to maintain people who have opioid use disorder so that they don't go into withdrawal, seeking out other more dangerous or illegal opioids. And the clientele from the very beginning was a private, well-insured, well-heeled, primarily white clientele.
And you sat in these clinics?
I was actually training in addiction medicine. This was in the early 2000s. And on one floor of the same building, Bellevue Hospital in New York City, I served patients on the fourth floor of the building who were in methadone treatment. And they would come in every day. They would be served their liquid methadone in a cup from behind a bulletproof glass window, observed taking it by a nurse to make sure that they were not keeping the drug, meaning hiding it in their cheeks so they could spit it out and sell it on the street afterwards. Often they would be accompanied into the bathroom to be observed urinating into a cup for urine drug testing. On the second floor of the same building, there was a primary care clinic, and these were patients that would come in for prescription refills for buprenorphine, which at that point was a brand new treatment. Buprenorphine patients were mixed in with other primary care clinic patients who were coming for hypertension treatment, diabetes treatment, asthma treatment. There were largely suburban white patients who would drive in from Long Island, Staten Island, and so the stark contrast between the methadone floor and who was being served there and how versus the buprenorphine floor had such a different, much less criminalized feeling about it. That led to my research that is the basis for my book.
It's been widely argued that all these opioid overdoses are the deaths of despair, really pointing to a deeper socioeconomic anguish in white communities. You want to complicate this claim. Tell me about this concept of whiteness, which informs your book, and how it makes sense of those deaths.
So Deaths of Despair is a classic example of how the racial politics of the U.S. and the class politics of the U.S. really leave invisible dynamics in black and brown communities that are parallel to those in white communities. The real problem with the Deaths of Despair argument, which was created by two Princeton-based economists, actually, who are quite concerned about the high unemployment levels across America, but particularly in the small industrial towns and former mining towns that have been hit hardest by overdose death rates, economic decline, and the need for much more investment in economic development and life-sustaining social support in the areas that have been the hardest hit by overdose deaths. It's not that, it's that their study was so restrictive. The soundbite was such a surprise from their study of the decline in U.S. white life expectancy in the last decade of the last millennium and the first decade of the 2000s was that white Americans had a decline of 5 years in their life expectancy in that time period, while almost every other racial ethnic group in the United States had an increase in life expectancy. But what they left out was that if you expand that window to look at the 2 to 3 decades before that window, you actually see deaths of despair in Black and brown communities as well. And those were decades in which there was an active heroin trade in very economically depressed Black and brown neighborhoods, and a very similar dynamic of economic decline leading to a disintegration of the basis for civic life and social services that sustain social connections. The difference is that Black and brown blue-collar workers were unemployed and suffering deaths of despair 20 to 40 years earlier than white American blue-collar workers because they were not eligible for union membership in many cases, last hired, first fired in many of these blue-collar industries. So white workers were simply showing the dynamic that had affected Black and brown workers decades prior. And in the book, Theoretical Framework of Technologies of Whiteness really picks apart how white racial imagery propagated by politicians and in the media of Black and brown quote-unquote addicts versus white trustworthy patients of new narcotics have shaped markets and shaped drug policies in ways that explain the current overdose crisis. So in the case of OxyContin, for example, it was much easier for the developers and marketers to get around the DEA regulators and get FDA approval because they had showed imagery of the intended white consumer, those consumers that had the assurance trustworthy patients who used the drug as prescribed were not prone to addiction in the way that others were. And then the buprenorphine moment, buprenorphine was approved for private office-based treatment in the setting of really explicit congressional debates around the prescription opioid crisis. This new market of primarily white, often middle-class prescription opioid users that were beginning to die of overdose from the new generation of opioids, that was the intended market for buprenorphine, and that methadone was not considered quote-unquote appropriate for this new generation of opioid users that hadn't been thought of as addictive.
Can I ask you a sort of biographical question? Because on a personal note, your own early history gave you some insight into what you later began to research.
Since this is a radio show, you can't see that I'm actually a Black American. And I grew up in Oakland, California in the 1970s at a time that the state, under then Governor Ronald Reagan, was disinvesting from mental health care. And I was a child of a single mother. I grew up in my grandparents' home, and I had 4 uncles, 3 of whom struggled really mightily with substances and with mental health problems. They had come of age in the era of civil rights and Black power. They had experienced really severe discrimination in their schools and the workplace, and they had ended up with really serious mental health and substance use problems. And coming home to my grandparents' house, I never knew if I was going to encounter either an ambulance or a police car looking for my uncles. This was how I grew up. And my mother, who was a social worker and very attuned to racial justice, she and my grandmother, also was very attuned to racial justice, would sit with me at the dinner table and pick apart this kind of structural analysis, of systemic racism in the U.S. and how it was playing out in our own family. I really got inspired to look at how can community-based movements of people directly affected by an epidemic shape public policy and make an enormous difference in the outcomes of health problems.
Thank you so much. Now, when the talk turns to the manner in which drugs might cause harm, I do find it a bit difficult not to mention an occasion at my old university. It would have been the early 1970s, when a very earnest lady came in and lectured a group of students on the dangers of smoking marijuana. Now, her pronunciation of marijuana as marijuana caused some general tittering in the audience. But There was even more jollity in store because the Speaker's next problem was to pass around a small plastic bag of grass in order that everybody could have a sight of the pernicious substance so they'd know it when they saw it and could reject it. She appeared not to notice when a much lighter bag was returned. Now, I thought of that serious disjunction, if you like, between speaker and audience, between advisor and the advised, as I really enumerate on what works and what doesn't work in UK drug policy. It's entitled Drug Policy Constellations, the rule of power and morality, the making of drug policy in the UK. I'm delighted to be joined by its author, who is Alex Stevens, Professor in Criminal Justice at the University of Kent. Alex, I wonder if that little anecdote I just produced resonates with you. It's like there are two tribes.
This is the whole point of my book, which is about how the attempt to change drug policy to a more rational path solely by using the evidence is doomed by the fact that people's views on drug policy are not determined by the evidence, but by their moral positions, their emotional responses to what they think is right or wrong around drug use.
I've got a 2020 clip here. This is from BBC Two's Horizon. It's entitled Addicted to Painkillers, Britain's Opioid Crisis, which was presented by Dr. Michael Mosley.
In 2014, Karen popped a disc in the middle of her spine. Almost like having a red hot poker put between your vertebrae. Research suggests there could be as many as 28 million Brits like Karen living in chronic pain. Karen's doctor solution? Opioids. Starting on tramadol and ending up on morphine.
But they didn't sort the pain out. What they actually did was turn my beautiful, lovely, active wife into a zombie.
Curtains were always shut. The bed was always unmade. Was it always in it sleeping?
It was heartbreaking because the girls used to say, "Where's our mum?"
That programme did suggest there's a growing problem with prescription opioids in the UK. But listening to that clip of Helena Hanson's interview, do we have a problem with opioids which can be compared in any way at all to the North American epidemic, or are there just some key critical differences?
In the US, as Helena has just so fascinatingly described to us, it's a very different social context to other countries in Europe, including, sometimes to a lesser extent, the UK, where we have a very different attitude towards universal healthcare, to social protection, to whether people can get sickness benefits, whether people can employment protection, whether people can hard at work. It's a very different context in which we can grapple with the presence of opioids and other substances in their community. And it's to that social context we need to look if we want to explain why there's such a difference between the opioid situations in the States, where the deaths are usually rising, to Britain, where we've got a problem mostly to do with heroin, in combination with benzodiazepines and alcohol, and some emerging signs of other substances like that. The problems are very different and not based on the over-prescription of prescription opioids like this in the States.
Is it the case that those countries with the highest levels of consumption, but also the highest rates of overdose death?
No, it's not the case. 4 countries that have very high levels of population opioid consumption are USA, Canada, Germany, and Austria. Out of those 4 countries, it's only the USA and Canada which have very high rates of opioid deaths. That's because now of the presence of fentanyl in the illicit drug markets, partly because of the previous prescription of opioids creating that new market for opioids. That's not something that's happened in Germany and Austria, where the pharmaceutical industry has been much more tightly regulated, and where we haven't created a pool of people who are looking for pain relief because their lives are being made painful by the absence of social support.
But we do have to note the fact that with the drug poisoning deaths in England and Wales, they rose for the 10th consecutive year in 2022. That's the highest level since records began 30 years ago. Tell me a bit more about the drugs which are involved.
It's basically heroin, more than half of the opioid deaths are to do with heroin. But it's a different trajectory from the States. So the States have a longer history of problem. Here it arose in the 80s and 90s. This move from heroin being something that was a preserve of wealth and metropolitan in London to the deindustrialised parts of the Northwest where people took up heroin as a solution to the water supply when everything else was taken away. It's that group of people that are still the most vulnerable to life. So we're seeing a cohort of far too using heroin in the 80s and 90s who've grown old with the substance, become more vulnerable, and are dying in the most deprived, most deindustrialised areas that have the highest rates of death. For example, the deindustrialised cities of Scotland, Glasgow and Dundee, in the northwest and particularly the northeast of England, but it is Blackpool that is the town with the highest level of drug-related deaths in England. We also see high levels of deaths in South Wales, the aftermath of the coalage steel industry. We also see pockets in deprived coastal towns in South Wales. But it's that pattern of association between not drug use, but drug problems, and especially drug deaths with social deprivation that's so concerning.
Well, you've heard Helena Hansen talking about her study of how racism shapes the opioid crisis in the US. So I've really got to ask you, I mean,
Has this got any relevance in the UK context?
We have in the UK, as in so many areas of social policy, focused on the class aspects. It was only through going to a conference in the US that I was sensitised to this and going back a decade ago and did the science. And Helen was talking about the overrepresentation of black people in the criminal justice system for drug offences. I'm afraid to tell you that having done the science, that overrepresentation is even worse in the UK. So the last time I did the science, we were 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched for a drug offence if you were black, and 11 times more likely to be imprisoned for a drug offence if you're black than if you were white. These are actually greater disparities than we see in the US. Now, the consequences of that are not quite so severe because we don't send somebody to prison and we don't do things like taking the vote with any right social welfare benefits away from people who've been committing drug offences, as many states in the US do.
take me back a little bit, if you don't mind, to the period between the 60s and the 90s. And looking at the statistics, there seems to be a big increase in illicit drug use there, including heroin. So can you explain why that happened between those years?
There used to be what's known as the British system, where general doctors could prescribe heroin to their patients who had a car, depending on the substance. In a similar era when the Americans had decided that that would not be allowed, that heroin would be treated as regular offence. The British system was considered to be quite successful until the 60s because there was low levels of heroin use. But the story is told that there were a few doctors who had prescribed massive amounts. This was moved into methadone clinics rather than heroin dependent doctors. And so the heroin market went underground. Then what happened was that we saw global events such as the revolution in Iran and the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, meaning that Afghanistan became a plentiful supplier of the new form of heroin, brown heroin, into the market. That happened, unfortunately, exactly the same time as deindustrialisation created mass unemployment and a ready stream of customers for this newly arrived heroin. And it's that generation that still suffers the most from heroin problems. And if it were the case that the substances we're seeing crop up in small numbers in little clusters around the country, things like fentanyl, nitazines, if that were to completely overtake the market for heroin, as fentanyl has completely overtaken the market for heroin in the US, then you would see an escalation in deaths to even higher levels.
Now, you do describe the UK as having had long-standing harm reduction interventions in relation to heroin and synthetic opioids, but this has changed over time.
The reason it's changed over time is because there's been a difference in the perception of threat to what Helena's just called the suburban white population. When HIV and AIDS were considered to be a threat to that suburban population, there were measures put in place to ensure that HIV wouldn't be spread at high levels among people with check drugs level and extended to the rest of the population. But when that threat was successfully overcome, partly by harm reduction measures and also by new medicines, and the focus turned towards thinking about the crimes that people commit when they are using drugs that they become dependent. So we got in the 2000s a lot of people onto methadone based on the narrative that if you get people onto methadone and other forms of treatment, it will reduce their offending. That was met by another narrative, which was we've got too many people on methadone, we need to get people into recovery. And that coincided with the austerity era, so the huge cuts in drug treatment services that left them, the statements that described an official report by Dave Caroline was not for purpose. Now, belatedly, there's more money going into these services now. So we're playing catch up in terms of making progress on publication.
There at the start, Alex Stevens and my former guest, Helen Hanson. Thank you both. Next week, I hope you'll be sitting comfortably because I'll be investigating the politics of the body.
Thinking Aloud is presented by Laurie Taylor and produced by Jane Edging. Are men becoming more interested in talking and reading about love? The writer Howard Jacobson thinks they are, and he's delivering his point of view at 10 to 9 this morning. And looking ahead to Tuesday night,
Artificial intelligence is changing our world. It's now hard to figure out what's real and what's fake. How can you be certain that what you're hearing now was written by a human, or even spoken by me? And does it matter?
I think AI should be used for all the dull stuff, not all the art and creation and fun stuff.
What else is unreal about my world?
I'm Michael Sandel. Join me in an audience at the Hay Festival as we consider the ethics of AI, The Public Philosopher, on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds.
This Tuesday night at 8.
now on BBC Radio 4, it's On Your Farm with Charlotte Smith.
It's a beautiful day here in Gloucestershire. There's sunshine, and for once, thus far at least, no showers. Today, though, that is all wasted on me. I'm on a farm, but I don't even need my wellies.
We just need to get some PPE on, so we'll need white wellies or shoe covers, raincoats and hairnets.
I didn't think I'd need wellies today, but I kind of do.
Well, yeah, the food safe wellies, they're not really farming wellies.
I'm with Hannah Hophouse, who is the Deputy Chief Grower here. Hannah, are we on a farm, really?
Yes, we're definitely on a farm, a bit of a different farm. You might refer to us more as a plant factory than a farm. We're growing things, and the fundamentals of growing the plants is very similar to what you would do outside on a traditional farm. So yeah.
Okay, let's go see this. Well, we've walked into a room which doesn't feel like we're on a farm. It feels more like a food factory, to be honest. Imagine a big room in a warehouse, plastic protected walls, lots of pallets around. This is the beginning of a vertical farm. It grows things like salad, herbs, and according to the company which runs this one, the Jones Food Company, this is a very sustainable and efficient way of growing food. So how does it work? Well, that hopefully is what Hannah can explain. Hannah, is this the start, if you like, of your vertical farm process in here?
Yes, so this is the start of the loop and the crops journey. So as you can see, we're at the start of the long seeding conveyor belt, where we'll put on our growing trays, and our growing media goes onto the tray, which is an inert sheet made of wool and plastic, comes from offcuts from mattresses, and that's the perfect sort of anchor really is what it's providing for our seeds as they germinate.
So these growing trays are enormous. They're what? Metre by metre?
Just over, they're about 1.3 metres squared.
And then on top you put what, it just looks like a little bit of ratty blanket.
Almost, that's exactly what it is, yeah. It's just fibres and wool offcut from making mattresses, and they make it into these sheets for us and it works really well.
Why does that work as a growing medium?
Well, firstly, for the hydroponics, it's very important that it's completely inert, so it's not providing any nutrition to the plant. It's literally there just to anchor the roots and give the plant some support. And second of all, it has a good, it's not too thick, so it's not taking up too much room, and it has a good amount of air in it, so we can flood the benches and give them all the nutrition that they need without waterlogging, because that creates a nice air-filled area for the roots to grow into.
So you put the bit of mattress on top of your plastic tray, and then it goes onto the conveyor.
Exactly, then it's onto the conveyor. First of all, it goes under our watering for the wetting up process under the waterfall, and then through the seeding machine, which does all sorts of different seeds that we're seeding, and obviously to our set seed rates and distribution.
So what's it been seeding today?
So today we're seeding all of our salad crops, so everything from green lettuce to komatsuna and mizuna and some of our more unusual crops.
So once somebody has picked up the tray and put the bit of mattress on top.
Yes.
Nobody touches that tray in this process.
No. So yeah, this part is completely automated. Once the machine's been calibrated and set up for the morning, it goes all day with trays coming through. Obviously, the guys need to change the seeds when we swatch crops. But yeah, that's it. Otherwise, it does it on its own.
And where does it go next?
And then it's just going on the conveyor through the little hatch in the wall there into our germination room, which we'll go and have a look at. Bit of a different environment.
It's suddenly got a bit warm and a bit moist, and my glasses have steamed up. Oh my goodness. So it comes in here, and I can see where the conveyor goes, and then suddenly there is a stack, a big steel stack, and that's where the trays sit and germinate, is it? Hence the warmth.
Yes, exactly, yeah. So this is really where the crops are coming just for the first few days of their life to get the seeds started. Obviously, it's dark in here when there isn't anyone working. We're trying to emulate the plants being buried because they're just sown onto the surface. So we don't bury our seeds. So we have to keep this room really humid and warm and provide the perfect environment really for a quick and uniform germination.
How long then would, say, a salad crop, how long will they be in here?
Most of them 48 hours.
Is this all?
Yeah, 48 hours. The longest that a crop will stay in here is 5 or 6 days for some of the herbs that take a bit longer.
How warm is it?
So we're really keeping it as warm as we can with the heating that we have in here, and it's around 26 to 28 degrees normally. And we have sprinklers in the roof that go off at regular intervals to keep it nice and humid and stop anything drying out.